we have real problems in the United States with immigration, but holy moly, I'm glad we have our problems and not your problems. I
Yeah.
think most of the differences with regard to immigration for us, between us now and our historic experience, is mainly our changes in our society. We're a post-industrial, knowledge-based economy. We have a welfare state, things like this. But there is some element, a secondary element, in that the immigrants themselves are different
Mhm.
than they were in the past. Not as different, and for us, much less so. But I mean, just to put it frankly, large-scale Islamic immigration into non-Muslim societies creates problems. I mean, that's Sam Huntington put that colorfully in his Clash of Civilizations book, and specifically for Europe, Europe exists in opposition to Islam. In other words, it exists only because Islam, in a sense, created Europe almost.
Mhm.
And so that's a very different thing than, Guatemalan or a Chinese coming to the United States. There's some of them, there's still some historical baggage. The Mexicans still have a certain amount of that, although, that can be exaggerated. But the immigrants coming here just don't have the same historical experience with us, and the vast majority of them, to be blunt about it, are not Muslim. And even our Muslim immigrants, we have a smaller Islamic population numerically than France does, even though we're what, six times France's population. And our Muslim population is much more highly educated. They didn't come as bus drivers or factory workers, they came
Mhm.
as engineers or doctors. And the third element is they're much more ethnically diverse, so that they all hate each other. And I mean, in a normal way that people, the ethnic groups don't get along, and so those things together again make our challenge much more solvable, even with regard to Islamic immigration. Although there's exceptions, and the Somalis are a big one, where what you see is something more like what Europe is experiencing.
Mhm. So, I mean, here's where the rubber meets the road. We mentioned that the first thing we got to do is turn off the spigot. Okay, for any of these assimilationist, optimistic goals to make manifest, we first have to like pause where we're at so we can actually absorb all these different peoples. And I've been thinking about 1924 and this sort of immigration moratorium that takes hold after this massive wave. And to the extent there's a parallel between what happened in the early part of the 20th century and what's happened now, I'm looking at that and I'm wondering how could that be politically feasible? And maybe you could help just explain to listeners like what happened in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, what was going on at the time? How did the anti-immigration interests help marshal public and political sentiment behind them to institute something like this? I mean, they were faced, if I'm remembering correctly, with a lot of the same charges of being racist and all these other things, and there was a kind of moral case against them as well as an economic case. But they overcame all of this and were able to shut down immigration. So maybe you could explain, how did that happen? And is there any potential parallel that we can draw for what we might do now?
Um, Not to get too much into a history lesson, but Congress several times before World War One passed restrictions on immigration, numerical restrictions on legal immigration, and they were vetoed by both Republican and Democratic presidents. What changed, I mean, and then World War One came and immigration basically stopped because nobody could cross the Atlantic, immediately started right up again as soon as the war was over. And I think the key thing that that sort of changed the balance of politics was enough of the business community defected from the pro-immigration side
Mm,
because of fears of Bolshevism and anarchism. In other words, it was a kind of security concerns. It's not like, all the business people who were really kind of driving the bus as far as the politics goes back then shifted, but enough of them shifted because they figured basically, okay, I'll pay a nickel extra an hour in order not to be killed in my bed, is kind of
mhm,
to put it simply. Are there analogies today? I think probably. First of all, I think some non-trivial element of the tech community rethinking some immigration. There's still an issue with H-1Bs and all that, but there is openness, at least among sort of our current, not to be derogatory, but our current sort of robber baron element that is rethinking open immigration. I think actually we're not at the process where the stage where something's immediately going to happen on legal immigration. We're kind of in a transitional phase, because I think President Trump is a transitional figure, because he still views this issue through really kind of a generic Republican businessman perspective of legal good, illegal bad. It's just that he takes the illegal bad part seriously and means it, and that's a real change. But he's not a restrictionist. All the people working for him are, though, and the whole next cohort of Republican leaders on the right, J.D., Governor DeSantis, Senator Schmidt, Senator Hawley, Senator Cotton, they're all actual legal immigration restrictionists. And so we're not at 1924 yet. Maybe we're sort of before World War I stage politically of this working its way through.
Did the American left in 1924 start to turn on this issue? I mean, you mentioned like the big industrialists, for example, started to see the threat of Bolshevism as a sort of deciding factor in changing their mind about this. But did the left say to themselves, look, we represent, and this is like the typical anti-immigration from the left position from the left is our union people are getting paid less because there's a higher supply of workers, and therefore this suppresses wages in a very straightforward one-to-one way. And our unions have less power when they are in competition with foreign labor. So was there something like that operating at the time that also convinced people on the left to move away from this kind of open borders position?
Absolutely. I mean, Samuel Gompers, who organized the AFL, was one of the leaders. He himself was an immigrant, an English-Jewish immigrant, but he was one of the leaders in the push to restrict immigration because specifically the kind of social democratic reasons you described. In fact, I always get a kick out of the fact that the Cato Institute's office here in Washington, and the Cato Institute is sort of the most over-the-top, unlimited immigration voice
bad.
there is. When you go out the front door, you look out to the park across the street, and it's a statue of Samuel Gompers. I always get a big kick out of that. But yes, and even some of the non-union progressives, the people, the settlement house movement, those folks were seeing that, there needed to be a pause to be able to kind of absorb and improve the standards of people. The problem is today, or the challenge is, that so much of the left is now explicitly post-American in a way that wasn't necessarily the case back then, and not as much anyway. Some people were, Horace Kalin and those guys. But the regular left was still patriotic. In fact, really into the 90s. You had Barbara Jordan, who was a civil rights leader, first black woman elected to Congress from the South, was the chairman of an immigration commission under Clinton, who called for reductions in legal immigration. So that's all been gone. That's all gone now, though. The left is now a cultural left, not an economic left, and that makes it much harder to change policy.
There's an interesting other angle to this that I think highlights and supports your thesis as well. Last year I did some reporting with a team on the Venezuelan gangs who were taking over the apartment buildings in Aurora, Colorado. This was during the campaign. You probably remember the story. One of the things that we did, though, through FOIA requests and other document gathering, is that we showed that not only were these Venezuelan gang members taking over apartment buildings, but in many cases, they were doing so while being subsidized by taxpayers. The Biden administration sent money to the state of Colorado, sent money to the cities of Denver and Aurora, which then distributed the cash to left-wing NGOs. And what would give me also less hope that the left will come around is that the organized labor left has been in irreversible decline for many decades, but the NGO kind of post-American left has been in the ascension and gets a huge amount of cash flooding through that system for resettlement, for housing, for services, for meals, for welfare programs. We've seen this again in Minneapolis. It strikes me, and people ask, like, why are they into this? And there is a very real sense, well, because it is good for them, both for votes, both for ideology, and also because the system they've set up, unlike the labor left of the previous century, actually rewards not just immigration, but immigration from the least capable demographics who are most dependent on services. And so have you thought about how to break that chain? Because it seems to me that unless you can break that relationship or break that system, you're going to have this being more and more entrenched.